Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second session of our Series 1 Towards a New Civility. And this series, lasting for 4 months, will be exploring the ground to envision a new civility at a time when the shared human struggles have reached their peak and are calling for recalibration of the future direction of the human civilization trajectory. Today's session is titled An Islamic Methodology for Today, and our guest today is Professor Jasser Auda. Welcome, Dr. Jasser. Dr. Jasser is a scholar of Islam and he's a Shatibi Chair for Maqasid Studies at the International Peace University in South Africa. Dr. Auda is a founding and board member of the International Union for Muslim Scholars and the chairman of the Canadian Fiqh Council. He has a PhD in the philosophy of Islamic law from the University of Wales, UK, and a PhD in systems analysis from the University of Waterloo, Canada. He is the president of Maqasid Institute Global, a think tank registered and building research and educational projects in a number of countries. You can check their website, and I'm sure you'll find a wealth there. Dr. Auda's last contribution is a new Maqasid methodology that aims to bring about a restructuring of Islamic scholarship around a complex network of the higher objectives, maqasid, of the Quran and prophetic tradition. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jasser. Dr. Jasser, the floor is yours.
ما شاء الله أهلا وسهلا أهلا وسهلا بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أسعد خلقه وخاتم رسله محمد صلى الله عليه وآله ورضي الله عن المهاجرين والأنصار ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Thank you very much, Sister Rowan and Brother Talal and all of the wonderful brothers and sisters in Al-Sharq. I visited you a couple years ago in Istanbul, and we had one lively and intense and high-level discussion on a number of issues. And therefore, I was very happy to participate in this series on a new civility. And I find the topic to be very important because if we are imagining a new civility, then we are imagining a new approach, a new methodology, a new way of looking at things. You really cannot imagine a new anything without some form of a renewal. And renewal is an Islamic concept. Tajdeed is an Islamic concept in which you kind of reformulate or reapproach topics. And in order to reformulate, you have to do what we call in English a paradigm shift, a shifting of the way you look at things into a new way. And without this paradigm shift, without, if we're talking in the Islamic language, إعادة التصور, to reimagine and re-envision, without re-envisioning and without having this shift in the worldview, it is not possible to apply or to reach a new civility. And this reimagining is actually a reinterpretation of what Islam is, and a deep kind of revision of the alternative views that Islam could present. That's why I was very happy to see in the description of this project that this is a deep and systematic dialogue, because this is exactly what I will try to present to you today, some deep and systematic approach. In order to think of a worldview, we need to think of the logic of things, how we think about things, and how we argue for truth. And we'll try to share with you some of the slides I have here. Okay. Not sure if you see my screen. It's fine, alhamdulillah. So basically, the title of Islamic methodology for today is about how to look at a new logic, a new way, a new reference. And in Islam, the old and new reference is al-wahy, is the revelation. is the message that went down on this mountain to the Prophet ﷺ, the Mount of Hira, as he was there, where the angel came to him with a book or a message and Iqra. So basically, the entry point here and the reference point is Iqra, is Al-Wahi, is the revelation. This is not to say that the revelation is the only study that we will do. We will study the universe as well, and life and societies and so on. But the ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that composes this wahi should be read through al-wahi. So when you read the Quran, you should read it through the Quran. And when you read the Sunnah, which is a bayan or an illustration of the Quran, you also read it through the Quran. And when you read the universe, you cannot read the universe with a different reference. And that is an important point in the reconstruction that we will talk about. We really cannot have two worldviews. One worldview that is approaching the universe through the wahi, through the revelation, and another worldview that approaches the universe through our own whims, that is not based in the revelation. It doesn't mean that the revelation has every mathematical equation and every theory of physics, but it means that it has the principles that govern every mathematical equation and every theory of physics. And this is going to be the question of how that I will try to answer in this, inshallah, brief lecture. The definition of fiqh as well here is very important, because we define fiqh in a secular way to be the Islamic law or the Islamic jurisprudence, and we define the fuqaha to be the jurists. But the real fiqh, now if we go to al-wahi or the revelation, the real fiqh is a deep understanding and is a leadership and is a comprehension of the ayat of the universe too. قد فصلنا الآيات لقوم يفقهون. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that he detailed the ayat or the signs or the proofs for people who have fiqh, he did not mean only the signs or the proofs in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, but he also meant the signs of the mountains and the skies and the stars and animals and marine life and societies and humanity and so forth. And therefore, the approach here, when we talk about an Islamic civility, is an approach for a deen. And a deen in this sense is not a theology and is not a religion in the Latin sense. The deen is a way of life, is an approach, is a worldview. It is not a faith in the secular sense, where I am in my faith, in my place of worship, which is the mosque then, or some of my dealings, like, I don't know, family law and a few of the financial transactions and my rituals, and the rest of life has nothing to do with the deen. That is not Islam. And therefore, the outline of the ideas that I will present to you quickly, inshallah, is this logic that I'm telling you about that needs to be renewed before we enter a different tasawwur or a different worldview or a different framework by which we can analyze knowledge and deal with knowledge in a different way from an Islamic point of view. We will talk about some current methodological challenges, the importance of methodology, al-manhaj, al-manhajiyya, or how to approach things with a manhajiyya or with a manhaj respectful kind of way, and the opportunities because of these challenges that we have in order to get out of our limitations and approach the Islamic knowledge in a comprehensive and a different and a fruitful way, inshallah. And therefore, we'll talk about the reorientation of the Islamic worldview. What are the components of that? And then I will present to you a 5-step methodology that in the Maqasid Institute, we have a number of researchers who work through this methodology on a number of applied, natural, social sciences in order to restructure these sciences from an Islamic point of view and in order to analyze major phenomena from an Islamic point of view. And at the heart of this methodology, there is a framework of 7 elements that I will present to you. The basic shift that we need to do is in how we approach both the ayat of the book and the ayat of the universe. Um, we need to realize from the ayat of the book that everything in the universe is connected, and that we cannot really approach a phenomenon from a discipline, because disciplinary studies are really market-based. They are economically divided in order for the labor force to be divided into engineers and doctors and jurists and theologians and philosophers and historians. But the study of phenomena and the dealing with a real life, if we are thinking of reimagining the Islamic civility or reimagining life in that sense, we have to realize that everything is connected. We cannot really approach a phenomena like, for example, the pandemic that we're living through these days through a medical lens, because most of the people who die because of the pandemic die for economic reasons, not for medical reasons. The medicine is there. Apparently, I don't know, Trump took the medicine and after 48 hours, he was fine. But it really depends on who administered the medicine and where and how are the hospitals working. Yes, of course, death is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordained. Everybody has a length of life, but that length we don't know. So we could preserve our life and we could waste our life. We cannot go and kill somebody and then say that they had to die anyway. No, well, yes, they had to die, but I'm not supposed to kill them and then say that they had to die. So the point is that if we are thinking of a phenomena like the pandemic, even if we think in terms of the fatalities are tied to the politics of the time, that are tied to the economics of the time, how we define medicine and the role of the pharmaceutical industry in that medicine, and how we define a social response for a pandemic. If we ask people to sit at home, how are they going to eat? In Canada here, which is one of the, I guess, more advanced social systems kind of countries, we have a percentage of hunger these days. And we have relief organizations, Islamic and otherwise, they go out and feed people because people are hungry. In Canada and in Europe and in America now, 50% of the children are hungry. You see, if we reach that point as Western civilization, I'm not talking even about countries that are struggling with social and economic issues. Therefore, our logic has a problem here because we are not connecting all the facets of knowledge and all the sides and dimensions of a phenomenon as we study phenomena. People are becoming very sick in terms of their psychology and their mental health because of the lockdowns and so on, especially in countries like, again, Canada and the West, where there is a lockdown, a serious lockdown. And people in these countries where liberalism is going too far, people have the option actually to commit suicide in hospitals, in what we call here a assisted death or whatever, euthanasia, but it's really assisted suicide. That is, or murder, if you want to give it an Islamic name. And because of that, people go to the hospitals and they have the option to just tick a button and somebody will come and take their life in the hospital. And this is becoming very high because people with disabilities, minorities, like here in Canada, the natives, for example, who are really marginalized in the society, and there is a lot of injustices against them, people who of color, and there is racism problems here, just sometimes choose to end their lives because the medical system allows them to press a button and somebody will come and give them an injection and they die. That is a big problem in dealing with the pandemic. That is not the vaccine, and it's not necessarily whatever pills that they are suggesting. This is a social problem and a problem in the philosophy of the society itself and the philosophy of the state. Being a liberal state, and so forth. And having a liberal government, of course, has its advantages, but then liberalism could go too far sometimes and allow people to end their lives, and people are ending their lives by the thousands in Canada, which is a small country. And therefore, it becomes a problem. The logic of webs, we cannot really study the environment only by studying the trees and the plants and the animals, but we should study the industries that are affecting their lives and study how we approach energy. The energy question is a question about forests and oceans and so on. Because if we do not um, apply energy the way we apply, if we do not depend on oil the way we do, therefore we would not have as many problems politically to start with. I mean, speaking to an audience mostly from the Middle East, political problems because of the oil. The oil is becoming a curse rather than a blessing because there's so much attention to that part of the world, despite the fact that it's not doesn't really produce much culture and ideas and institutions, but it produces oil, and therefore there is a lot of attention and a lot of interest in the politics of these countries and so on. Can we change the energy paradigm? Yes, but we have to change the philosophical paradigm first. We have to think in a different framework. Of course, solar energy is a very good step forward, and wind energy and so on. But Earth is full of energies other than the solar and the wind energy. And the solar energy by itself is not exploited enough. Why? Because the market defines how it is used. It has to be profitable. And therefore, we are putting the market interest, which is really the interest of the top tier, the 1%, 10%, if you wish, of humanity, versus the rest of humanity. That thinking about the universe is a thinking at the heart of which there is an economic philosophy and an environmental philosophy and a state philosophy that is not Islamic. And therefore, when we think from an Islamic point of view, we have to realize that Islam should not be defined secularly. Islam has to be defined as a way of life. And I will get into these elements that define an Islamic worldview. But these elements, the concepts, objectives, the values, the commands, universal laws, parties, and proofs, in addition to the Quran and the Sunnah, they are connected in a web that makes some objectives or maqasid or higher purposes emerge. And these objectives are going to be our guides towards a new worldview. We have a problem in the contemporary approaches for Islamic scholarship, and I'll do this very briefly because I would like to give time for a lot of, inshallah, comments and Q&A. We have a lot of imitation of history, and we copy from previous times when colonization was dominant in the Muslim majority societies, and therefore Islam was marginalized in a particular way and redefined in a very secular system. And we do a lot of imitation for that. Or we go back in history and do imitation from the time of the height of the Islamic civilization, but without going to the depth of why the Islamic civilization was at its height. Why did the Islamic civilization flourish? Because people relied on a system that was not under the monopoly of government and was not under the monopoly of businesses. It was a system that was basically based on awqaf or endowments. And when the Islamic civilization was doing medicine based on endowments and doing knowledge, education, universities, and so forth based on the endowments, the houses of books or the libraries in English in modern sense were endowments and so forth. It was a different civilization. And therefore, we copy the books, but we do not copy the model of what produced the books. These books and these major strides in the Islamic sciences and so on, we call them Islamic just to refer to that time, but they were sciences for humanity. They were done because of a system that was not under the political interests. Some of it was, but very minor impact on the civilization, and was not under necessarily the trade and the business. Today, the knowledge is squarely defined based on political interests or business interests. And therefore, we don't have the knowledge basis or the knowledge institutions that are academically free, seriously, that would allow us to produce knowledge. Imitation, lots of problem. Partialism, looking at Islam from one lens, the lens of fiqh in the sense of all jurisprudence, the lens of kalam or philosophy, the lens of theology or aqidah or faith only, and therefore this tajzi or partialism is harming our approach to Islam. Apologism, and especially the apologism for modernist institutions. We deal with Islamic politics within the modern state, and we do not imagine any development in the institution of the modern state. And we think of Islam within that framework. We think of Islam within basically capitalist economics. And we do not think outside the box of capitalist economics. And therefore, we do finances and so on, but within the capitalist economics. We cannot be, entrepreneurial enough to develop capitalist economics as capitalist people are trying to anyway in different countries and different systems. We think of the Islamic psychology within the science of psychology as it is studied in today's American textbooks or textbooks from Oxford or Russia or wherever you live in the Islamic world. And therefore we apologize for, for the Chicago School in economics. We apologize for Darwin or Freud. We are thinking within frameworks that do not belong to the Islamic view, but we use legal tricks sometimes, and we try to apologize for what is there. It's very important if we are going to reach renewal that we avoid that. We carry contradictory references, as I mentioned, tanaqud, in the sense that I have a secular framework and I have an Islamic framework, and in the mosque and in the family and so on, I'm Islamic. And when it comes to the stock market or the environment or the law, I'm secular. And this double worldview realize or manifest in a double morality that we see oftentimes, especially in people who live under secular systems. Sometimes they cannot really reinterpret a place under the secular system, and they end up having two moralities because they have two worldviews. And the deconstruction as well, if I may, could be also a problem in the sense of thinking of Islam without differentiating between the revelation and the interpretation of the revelation. And therefore, we deconstruct, we think about the relationship between knowledge and power, or we think about the relationship between the signified and the signifier and all of that in terms of the revelation as much as we do in terms of the culture. We could deconstruct culture, but we cannot really deconstruct the revelation because the revelation is above culture. The revelation is supposed to reign over our cultural practices and cultural understanding. That is the Islamic worldview. Because if we take our cultural deconstruction and go to the Quran and Sunnah as scripts, as a nas, that will become a major problem. And therefore, we need to reorient the Islamic worldview in terms of knowledge, in terms of the reality, how we read history, how we read our current reality, and how we read the future. When we read the current reality, for example, how do we define success and failure? When do we say that a certain country is doing very well? What are the indices that we use? Are they the the World Bank Knowledge Index and Freedom House Index? And what indices? What criteria are we judging the reality with? And how do we read history as well? What is the rise and fall of history as we read it? because history defines our identity. And we kind of identify with the higher points in the Islamic history. These higher points, why are they higher points? And how do we judge that they are higher points? Based on what? Based on, how strong the army was, or how rich the sultans were, or are we judging based on how vibrant the society was, and how truth prevailed over falsehood? And this is our supposedly top points in our civilization, even if they were apparent defeats for people who carry that truth. And this is a different way of looking at history and current reality, and thinking about the future. And therefore, the scholarship here has a role to apply knowledge to reality, to re-envision knowledge from the depth of the logic of the knowledge to the sources of knowledge, or what they call in the English language, the epistemology of it, to the definitions of things, or the conceptualization, or التصورات, or perhaps what philosophers like to call the ontology, in the reality. How can we apply that knowledge to the reality? In order to do that, another shift in the logic needs to be done, which is a shift to the objectives, or to the maqasid, because the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is an objective-based book. There is nothing that Allah created or made or judged that is mentioned in the book without an objective. This is more about teleology or a purposefulness than about causality and cause and effect. The cause and effect is there in the book, in the logic of the book. Yes, the water falls from the sky and the plants grow and so forth. But the majority of the approach in the book, what the book is really teaching us in terms of thinking, is to teach in terms of the purpose. We are created to worship Allah. That's the ultimate purpose. And under worshiping Allah, there are a number of other purposes that if we achieve, then we worship Allah. Obviously, the worship is not just the rituals and prayers and fasting and so on, part of it too, but it's not only the worship. Islahul ard, the rectification of earth or reforming earth, that is part of these objectives that if we reach the worship of Allah. How do you rectify earth? By preserving life. Allah is talking about the corruption on earth by killing animals and plants. And when we preserve animals and plants, then we are not corrupting earth, we are rectifying it. We are doing islah. The islah by connecting the families, salat al-rahim, by being good to your kin and to your relatives and your neighbors and so on. And the cutting or the severing of what Allah ordered us to connect. When you sever what Allah asked you to connect, you are corrupting earth. And therefore, when you avoid that, you are rectifying earth and you are worshiping Allah. There is a whole pyramid, or rather network of objectives that will give us a future orientation. When we think about why, we are thinking about something to be achieved in the future, and a critical orientation, because when we think about why, we start to criticize. Why the bank? Why the state? Why the family? Why, why should I be clean, or why should I be healthy? When I ask these questions, the answer of that are going to move me to a higher level of wisdom and thinking in terms of objectives, and will allow me to criticize. Because if a state is supposed to be for the welfare of the people, then if the state defies the welfare of the people and kills the people and destroys the people, then the state is not legitimate, because that's the role. It's the instrument for something. If the economic activity is supposed to be for prosperity of humanity and welfare, and and it's not doing that, then this would be my window to criticize the economic activity that is not going to achieve. If medicine is supposed to be for the health of the humanity, and medicine is not doing that, then this is the way to critique the medical philosophy and so forth. And the maqasid based or the objective based approach is a comprehensive approach in the sense that I'm looking at the holistic system. I'm not being lost in the details. And this is one of our major problems in our Muslim mind these days, is that we are lost in the details and in the rules and so on. All of them are part of Islam. But people, live and die day and night talking about details and not looking at the bigger picture. Um, a proposed methodology in order to approach this is to think in terms of the purpose and then to do cycles of reflection within the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in order to come up with a framework that is going to allow us to do critical studies of the literature and reality, and therefore come up with formative theories and principles that will allow us to approach the reality. And we cannot really approach the reality in a comprehensive way without thinking at the level of theories and principles. And we cannot borrow theories and principles from sciences that have philosophies contrary to Islam and impose them on the Islamic science or the Islamic knowledge, and therefore come up with Islamic rules or Islamic understandings. It's not, this will be contradictory and apologetic and will have all sorts of issues. And therefore, there is a central position here for the formative theories and principles, and not for thinking about Islam in terms of one ayah that implies one rule or one hadith that implies one sunnah. That is a very simplistic way of understanding Islam. And in the bigger picture, it is making us victims to the bigger philosophies and the bigger systems that define the frameworks for us. And therefore, critical studies is very important as part of reaching the formative theories and principles. And that framework, which I will explain next quickly, has to do with a number of objectives. One is to reach the objective. So there is an objective of establishing objectives and achieving objectives and realizing objectives in our lives. There is another objective of correcting concepts. There are a number of concepts at the heart of the revelation that should be at the heart of the Islamic worldview. And if we approach life without the right concept of family, the concept of humanity to start with, what is a human? You see, human is defined economically in a way different from its definition in psychology, from the definition of anthropology, from the definition in arts, and every science or art is defining humans in a different way. There is a multidimensional and comprehensive and very intricate definition of human in Islam that is very important to be at the heart of these concepts, because we really cannot build an economy based on a definition of human that is all greedy and all knowledgeable and all of that. And then you claim to build an Islamic economy based on that. That is not going to, or to build a history that you approach through anthropology, archaeological or social, um, on a Darwinian worldview, where the concept of the human is actually something that used to be a single cell and developed and became an ape, and eventually the ape became human. And that's how history is. That history in Islam has a very different way. We are a phase. We are a khalifa, a successor in that sense. Were there creatures before us on earth? Of course. The Quran is saying this all over the place. And therefore, we didn't, yes, we might have gone through a stone age in some of the areas and so on. But from day one, humanity had a language, humanity had law, humanity had faith to start with. The Egyptians did not invent a tawheed or unity of Allah. This was from the time of Adam. And the Iraqis did not invent the law. This was from the time of Adam too. And so forth. We have a different perception of history and the definition of humanity if we are going to take the Islamic perspective. The proofs that the Quran is giving us in terms of its logic, in terms of how it defines fallacies, the parties that are tied to these concepts, al-ilm and al-ulama, al-hukm and al-hukam, and so forth, parties are defined according to concepts. The sunan or the universal laws are tied to the objectives and the concepts, the proofs and the parties, the commands, do's and don'ts, that we made Islam all just about the commands. But we really cannot do the commands properly if the commands have no objectives, if they are not tied to their objectives, if they are not tied to the right concepts. I cannot apply the family law on the wrong definition of family in Islam. Because yes, the family law has do's and don'ts, but what is the concept of family? What is that? And how, based on the concept of family, how can I understand the laws of family? Not the laws of the family on a family that is corrupt from the Islamic point of view. The values are also very important. The values of beauty, the values of benefit and harm, the values of morality. This is all a web that is going to give us the backbone of the Islamic worldview. And if we work through this, we can read, let's say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through all of these 7 elements. And if we form a picture of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the concepts, the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the groups, believers in Him, disbelievers, hypocrites, messengers, friends, enemies, and so forth, the sunan, the universal laws, the laws of change, the laws of diversity, the laws of creation, the values of mercy and peace and strength and love and so on. All of this is tied just to analyzing the concept of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The signs in the horizon and in the souls that will lead to Him, the commands and the prohibitions and the decrees, advices and so on, and the worshipping of Him and the balance and so on. We cannot really think about the family law without thinking of a whole group of concepts and groups and universal laws and values and proofs and commands and so on in order to have a hybrid and complex. We cannot think of medicine without thinking of the human and the sickness and medicine and rights and knowledgeable and knowledge and cure and equity and healing and so forth, all from the Islamic point of view. Otherwise, our thinking of medicine will be very superficial. And therefore, between the two frameworks of the revelation, here, the revelational objectives, concepts, parties, and the human-made objectives, concepts, parties, we can have the thinking of the different sciences, the formation of the different theories and principles. I have to go quickly. In that sense, we cannot really continue to look at disciplinary studies in silos, but we have to start to form a network as we think of disciplinary studies. And we have to move from disciplinarity to multidisciplinarity, and from multidisciplinarity to transdisciplinarity, which is phenomena studies. And this would be a genuine Islamic approach, because the disciplinary studies and their silos and their philosophies do not come from the Islamic point of view in the contemporary age. And in order to reconstruct the Islamic contemporary worldview, we have to look primarily through phenomena in order to be able to deal with them to achieve the Islamic objectives. Finally, strategic studies are very important in that sense, because research that I'm talking to you about and all sorts of ideas and deep knowledge and so on, this is not just academics or theory. This has to be tied to education, and education and research have to be tied to action. We really cannot act without doing research, which is what we have been doing in the Islamic realm for a long time. Research is very weak, and it's not deep enough when it comes to critique and dealing with sciences as they are and the world as it is. And we jump into action without giving enough research, without having research centers. Alhamdulillah, there's a growing number of research centers and research initiatives, and people are thinking anew, especially now in the time where many Muslims in the world are feeling the crisis, feeling the problem that we have because of the lack of ideas, and therefore the lack of institutions, and therefore the lack of movements and the lack of change. We really cannot have a change in terms of action without a lot of research that is going to take us to a reconstruction of our educational systems from the Islamic point of view, and eventually effect a change in terms of action. So I hope I didn't give too many ideas for this 40 minutes that I'm allowed in, but I wanted to open as much time as I can for Q&A and comments. This is a long story. I just wanted to give an introduction, and perhaps we have, inshallah, more opportunity to realize these thoughts into more intense discussions. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jasser. Actually, did you gave us a lot of material, food for thought, and I myself have written 6 questions.
Oh.
يعني, if I am given the floor, I would take over the whole session.
I answer questions. That's what I do in life.
Thank you very much. Please allow me to welcome Mr. Waddah. He's with us in the session. He has joined us earlier.
MashaAllah, MashaAllah. Ahlan wa sahlan. Ahlan wa sahlan.
So let's start the Q&A session. Please, if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box or use the raise hand function to address Dr. Jasser. And inshallah, I'll be taking your questions and giving them to the doctor. I'll start with the first question, which probably comes to me from the very title of the session, which is an Islamic approach. How do we define an Islamic approach? Is there like one Islamic approach? And that's that I think that's a big and challenging question, because if we, let's say, come to think of what are the values or what are the objectives, I think every single scholar would rank and would come up with values on his own, rank them differently. So how is it? Can we say that it's an Islamic necessarily?
Well,
Yeah.
let me answer. Is there one Islamic approach or many Islamic approaches? The approach to this question is a fallacy. Is a fallacy of binary thinking. We either think of one Islamic approach, and therefore this approach of mine is the only way to understand Islam, or we say that there are many Islamic approaches, and therefore every Muslim has a different way of understanding Islam. And therefore, eventually, we deconstruct and say there is no Islam because there are many Islams. Actually, the truth is somewhere in between. Yes, there is one Islamic approach, and yes, there are many Islamic approaches. There is one Islamic approach in terms of the core attributes of Islam. There is no Islamic approach that is not going to be about the oneness of Allah and about the Quran and Sunnah and Muhammad and the messengers, and about how to worship Allah in terms of rituals and so on, in terms of the 5 pillars of Islam, in terms of justice and family, in terms of society and neighborhood, in terms of not doing usury. And yes, but then under usury, we could have a number of interpretations if we agree to the principle that we are going to think of an economy without usury and without monopoly, but we could differ in some of the details. So there is one Islamic approach, but there are a number of interpretations that differ as a spectrum, but not differ in terms of contradiction. Because we think in terms of a logic, as I mentioned in the beginning, that is not a web-based logic, that is still Greek in terms of our thinking, the binary. Greeks spoke everything in binary terms. Read Aristotle's categories or any of that. It's a binary thinking. And that binary thinking dominates the Islamic mind. So yes, there is one Islam, and the Quran and Sunnah are what defines Islam. Yet we could have a number of readings, but these readings do not contradict as much as most people could think, because if they refer to the core of Islam, they are going to be Islamic, and there will be diversity in Islam, which is part of the nature of Islam. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you. Until questions start coming in and people warm up to give their questions, I'll just add another question, which is about the methodology to read the Quran. So if we're centering the Quran at the heart of this Islamic approach, but then how do we read the Quran, and
Yes,
in which ways we derive these values and objectives and proofs? And
exactly. We have a problem in reading the Quran in contemporary times because we tend to read the Quran in a very linguistic way, in the sense of just looking at the language. And when we connect, we don't connect meanings, but we connect the roots of the Arabic words. So we approach al-adl, for example. Adala ya'dulu. Where did Allah say adl? And maybe a qist, okay, because it's close to al-adl. And then he said adilu and kunu qawamina bil qist. But we do not think of al-adl as a meaning that is tied to its objectives. Al-adl as an objective. What are the objectives that will lead to al-adl? Al-adl, as an objective, it's connected to a web of objectives. As a concept, how does the concept of justice affect other concepts of family, of trade, of other concepts? How al-adl and the dhulm and so on, what is the relationship between al-iman or mu'minun, the believers, and al-adilun and the muqsitun, the people who are just or equitable? What is the relationship between hypocrisy and injustice? The Quran is talking a lot about this. So when somebody is a hypocrite, which we see a lot of in Islam these days, they commit injustices because they come from a point of hypocrisy. When somebody is a corrupter or mufsidun, they commit injustice too. So part of a dhulm or injustice is al-ifsad or the corruption. And when we think in terms of these elements, and of course deriving these elements is a long story, they started by studying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the revelation. If you study how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is from the beginning, Bismillah, the name of Allah, and you study the names, al-asma' dhatu sultan, the names with authority in the revelation, and from the names with authority we go to the concepts and the commands and the values and so on, and you build a framework or a worldview of the universe from the understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as he is described in the scripts. So that's how, in summary, you get to this. But once you approach issues in terms of meanings, not just a linguistic approach and not only a historical approach, and you go to Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah and Khaldun to understand Islam, they are part of the history of Islam, but they are not necessarily equal to Islam, you see. And the other approach is the fiqh approach, the approach where you ask a jurist about a rule, but the rules are a part of Islam. They are not everything about Islam, you see, and so forth. So when we approach the Quran with the question of how, we have to go beyond the historical, the linguistic, the legal, and all of the other partialistic approaches. And we look at the Quran in a comprehensive way and analyze it in a comprehensive methodology. That's a short answer for the question of how.
thank you. We have a question. So moving from disciplinary to multi-transdisciplinarity, while grounded in an Islamic paradigm, how can Muslims engage with fields that are founded based on an epistemology that is detached from revelation?
Well, to approach the fields in terms of critical studies. Every field deserves to be respected in terms of what it does. So without the fields of economics and legal studies and physics and politics, we would not have a lot of the human achievement that we have today. So we acknowledge the disciplines for what they are, but we have to approach the disciplines from an Islamic point of view with critical eyes. We should reconstruct the disciplines in terms of these elements that I talked about. For example, concepts when we look at the discipline of economics, what is the concept of wealth? How do we define wealth? So far, we define wealth in a capitalist way. We don't define wealth from the Islamic point of view. Or we go to the history, as I mentioned, and we define al-mal and so on as the fuqaha defined it 1,000 years ago. But when we approach the economics from an Islamic point of view, it is not just about the financial transactions, what we call Islamic finance, but we should reconstruct the economic theories from the Islamic point of view by defining wealth, by defining what is the central institution in an Islamic economy. The central institution so far in today's world is the bank. That is at the heart of economics. In the Islamic experience and the Islamic worldview, the central institution is the waqf, is the institutions that are owned by nobody but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is a very different economy when the majority of the economic transactions are happening under the awqaf rather than happening under the bunuk or the banks. In fact, the whole institution of banks and money and so on, I'm not an economist, so I cannot really speak about that. I'm just giving highlights, right? What are the basic concepts that define economics? What are the objectives of it? And who are the parties that are defined? And these parties, how compatible they are with the definition of parties from an Islamic point of view. And the sunan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how can they apply to the field of economics this way? When we talk about archaeology, how do we define that? Archaeology is defined for those who are interested in a very colonialist way. And it puts Europe in a very central position in the definition of archaeology as a model of technology and development and language and society and everything. But when the Europeans came to North America, where I live now, the natives were more advanced actually than the Europeans. The Europeans had more guns, but the natives had better art and better culture and higher language and more comprehensive history and music and architecture and everything. But the Europeans dictated the way history is written because of their guns. And it's very important to redefine that. Africa has the same issue. The Africans were more developed in many ways, in a long history with culture and with languages and diversity and so forth. And they lost the battle because of the military means. Military means are important, but they are not equal to civilization. So how do we approach disciplines with a critical eye? And it's important to reconstruct disciplines. I'm not saying that we should go beyond disciplines, but we should reconstruct disciplines now so that we start to have multidisciplinary studies. And from multidisciplinary studies, we start to have real Islamic transdisciplinary studies, because the Islamic studies cannot be really faithful to disciplines and narrow silos of disciplines. Wow.
Thank you very much for that. I read Rashad's question. Wait, okay, seem to know each other. So Islamism as a means to revive an anemic, moribund, and colonized Muslim society. على أفغاني عبدو إقبال قطب مودودي, despite gaining major traction across the world, seems to have failed, putting the objective of political emancipation, technological advancement, and cultural revival as an imperative. Was this not inconsistent with the Quranic emphasis, Sunan of Allah, raising whom He pleases based on the righteousness, my righteous servants inherit the earth?
Well, Jazakallah khair, Rashad, a student of mine from South Africa. I'm proud to be a teacher of his, an economist and policymaker. Akhi Rashad, yes, I think that Islamism, it depends on what you mean by Islamism. If you're talking about the Islamic movements of today, yes, I think they need major reimagining and re-envisioning and reconstruction. And I do think that they played an important role, but as of now, we need to re-envision Islamism. If you want to, Islamism in the sense, in the general sense of the word, if you want Islam to be an approach, not necessarily to take over the nation state in the Islamism way, because that proved to be a futile kind of philosophy and objective. إقامة الدولة الإسلامية, that is, the forming of an Islamic state, I think that is not the most appropriate objective for now. It might have been 100 years ago when Muslims dealt with colonization. But today, with post-colonialism, Islamism is to make Islam relevant to today's world. And Islam would be relevant to today's world without all of these things that you mentioned, that has to do with taking over a nation state and the issues that we have in the past decades in terms of the Islamic parties and the Islamic movement. So if you want to call it Islamism or you want to call it post-Islamism, that is also fine. But within Islam, anyway, we're not departing from Islam. In fact, we are trying to go back to Islam in its original vision and see, was Islam about a nation state? No, it wasn't. Was Islam about a transactions that we call Islamic that are built on top of a riba system, on top of a usury-based system? No, it wasn't. Islam was a vision for a new world. And this doesn't mean that we wake up in the morning in the new world, but it means that we work in parallel lines. Some of them are traditional in terms of the renewal of the traditional sciences and the traditional movements. Some of them are disciplinary in terms of the reconstruction of the disciplines that are already shaping our market and our science and our knowledge. But some of them are totally new, coming from a different paradigm that is trying to imagine a different polity and a different economy and a different society from an Islamic point of view. So the answer of the question is not really to give up everything that happened so far in the Islamic movements and the past century, but to criticize, reconstruct, and re-envision them towards the future, and to think about Islam anew. So I hope that this answers the question. It's a long story, but I hope that this gives highlights for this question, inshallah.
I feel like it's a question that deserves not only one session on its own, probably many sessions. So we have a question from the Facebook audience. Can the Shaykh demonstrate the 7 elements of Ijtihad al-Maqasidi using consensus and Fiqh academies, please?
The consensus as in ijma'. Well, if you are asking about usul al-fiqh, if you are taking this methodology as a reference, usul al-fiqh are a special case of the manhajiyya. Usul al-fiqh are not the wider framework of the understanding of Islam. Usul al-fiqh are the part of the methodology that deals with the legal side of Islam, the legal side as in the law, as in the legal system, al-qanun يعني, or the legal side as in fiqh, as in some of the ahkam that are mostly for the individual and the family. But if we start to move from the individual and kind of family rules law into the realms of the society, if we start to deal with, as I mentioned, economics and politics and psychology and history and arts and so forth, then we are not really talking about jurisprudence. We are talking about the Islamic thought, are talking about the wider circle of Islam. And usul al-fiqh in that sense, if you're talking about analogy and consensus, al-qiyas, wal-ijma', wal-istishab, wal-istihsan, and so on, and all of the tools that are used by the jurists, they would not be sufficient for an Islamic approach to the wider world. And therefore, the tools of usul al-fiqh in that sense are being reconstructed in that manhajiyya that I'm proposing in order to be a special case of dealing with the legal issues rather than being the overwhelming case. To address al-ijma', particularly the consensus, I'm not sure what consensus you mean, or ijma', because in one of my books, the Maqasid Sharia Systems Approach, I counted the 62 definitions of ijma'. So you can see that there is no ijma' or consensus on the definition of ijma' to start with. But if you take the definition in the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, لا تجتمع أمتي على ضلالة. This is the only reference where we have ijma' in the nas, in the sense, not in the وَاتَّبِعْ غَيْرَ سَبِيلِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ and all of these like loose arguments. But basically that the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has ijma'. And yes, if the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam agrees to a certain number of articles of Islam, then these articles are guidance and they would never be astray. And yes, these articles, every Muslim knows them. I understand ijma' in that sense, not the ijma' of the fuqaha in one particular school or one particular sect. This is history and we should go beyond that anyway.
Thank you, Doctor. So we have a question from Ragad. She says, I see common trends that focus in the values and objectives, neglecting all kinds of fiqh rules and the strictness and the sensitivity of the linguistic aspects of the Quranic text. Some do actually deny the Sunnah partially or completely as well. Is that included in the Islamic approach that you defined as one approach that has spectrums in it? Can this reductionism be included in the Islamic approach? If no, how that can be dealt with?
Well, my answer is no. The Islamic approach cannot deny the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, because if we refer to the Quran properly, the Quran said, وَمَا أَتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. The Quran is asking us to follow the Sunnah. So people who, in the name of going back to the Quran, deny the Sunnah, they are denying part of the Quran anyway, and that is unacceptable. The linguistic approaches, the linguistic sensitivity, of course, this is part of what we proposed here in this methodology, that we have to be sensitive to the language of the Quran. But what I'm saying here, that we cannot just be sensitive to the language of the Quran in terms of the tafsir, and not sensitive to the language of the Quran in terms of applying it to the reality. So if we are dealing with riba, what is riba in the reality that we deal with? And how can we have a riba-free economy? That is part of the thinking about riba, not just thinking about the ayat al-riba, and we go to the mufassirin of the old times who tell us their views of ayat al-riba. We have to have a new kind of tafsir, not saying that they are wrong, of course not, they are our imams and our teachers, but they looked at the Quran and tried to apply it to their times, and we need to look at the Quran and apply it to our times. To ignore the fiqh rules, and so of course not. The rules I mentioned under the commands, al-awamir, do's and do nots, they are integrative part of Islam. But what I am saying that they are not the only part, because we cannot really do and do not without understanding the concepts, without looking at the objectives, without referring to the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ to explain some of the do's and the do nots, and so forth. If you mean by the fiqh, the historical, you need to revise that, because the fiqh of Islam is not the history of fiqh. There is a difference between al-fiqh and tarikh al-fiqh, or the history of fiqh. And oftentimes when people talk about fiqh today, they talk about the history. They go and copy books from the past. And yes, there is a fixed part of Islam. We are not going to change how we pray or how we fast or how we do Hajj. Obviously not. So yes, we can copy from the past. But the majority of the Islamic rules are not from the past, are from the present. You cannot really seriously deal with contemporary society, contemporary medicine, contemporary economics, contemporary politics from the books of the past. And you go to Al-Mawardi to understand how we deal with the state today. No, Al-Mawardi doesn't operate within the state of today. And Ibn Khaldun doesn't operate within the society of today. And Abu Yusuf doesn't operate within the economy of today, and so forth. And it's very important that we have a balance between looking at the contemporary times and referring to the original sources, while understanding that the books of history are just books of history. They are not references for Islam. And it's important to understand that. Otherwise, we will be locked in history, and this is very detrimental for who we are as Muslims. You know, will marginalize the Islamic thought in today's world.
Thank you very much. I believe I will go for a question. I'll give myself that.
You had 6 questions.
Right.
Please.
But before that, the person who asked the question about consensus and fiqh academies has like sent a follow-up saying the question is whether fiqh academies could be a worthy inheritor of ijma'.
Yes and no. I mean, yes, because if all the fiqh academies judge a certain rule for today, then they are right in that sense. They are not ijma' in the sense of if you deny it, you're a kafir and all that. That's, you know, that's too extreme. But then they will be right. Yesterday I was in a seminar and we were discussing euthanasia or assisted suicide and so forth. And I mentioned that there is no single scholarly body today that has any different opinion about euthanasia, that it's haram, that we as a Muslim doctor, I cannot, or as a human doctor anyway, it's forbidden for me to take a life or to subscribe something lethal. Yes, I could prevent the medicine. That's a different story. Or, you know, avoiding medicine is one thing, but giving something lethal. Now, this is a matter of consensus. Could we consider this to be part of the Islamic jurisprudence? Yes. But is this the only way of building consensus? No. We need to build consensus on a number of levels. And we cannot really continue with the current structure of the Islamic education that feeds the Islamic fiqh councils, because we are needing more and more multidisciplinary scholars. Scholars in many of the fiqh councils are just unidisciplinary. His PhD is in a manuscript that was written by Al-Ghazali or Ibn Taymiyyah, or he compared you know, 2 books of hadith, and he became an Islamic scholar. That is fine in terms of the Islamic sources. But that same person cannot really deal with genetic engineering and AI and even a modern state and how policy is made and the current stock markets and they really don't understand anything about this. And therefore, and it's not enough to bring somebody who gives us a lecture for 20 minutes. I'm a member of a few scholarly bodies, and we bring a doctor to talk about the pandemic for 20 minutes. But then as a non-specialist, I really don't understand pandemics just from 20-minute lectures given by scholars of medicine. And therefore, if I am going to be a faqih that deals with medicine, I have to have proper training in medicine. And hence we are talking about multidisciplinarity. And multidisciplinarity is not impossible. Multidisciplinarity is very possible. The market doesn't allow it. And therefore, we have to have the economics of the education for what we are talking about. But if we have the right economics for this kind of education, yes, we can produce multidisciplinary scholars. It is possible to learn more than one discipline. And the scholars of the past learned more than one discipline. Not all disciplines, but more than one. And if the market is not going to oppress me into one discipline in order to be part of a bigger machine, and the market is going to allow me to be multidisciplinary, then I will be a better faqih. Because if I study medicine proper and I give 4 or 5 years of my time to studying medicine or studying chemistry or studying something that I will be talking about as a faqih, then I will be a much better faqih than somebody who studied the history of fiqh. You know, I studied madhab Shafi'i in my early studies and so on, and that doesn't answer 90% of the questions I get, you see. So that's follow-up for that. Your question, Sister Ron.
I'm not sure. Do you still have time for that? Well, يعني, with every idea that you introduce, I have more questions that come to my mind. So,
another session some other time, inshallah.
Inshallah. So I believe that that question was when you were talking about how the historical way of doing fiqh and reading the Quran was limited to or like it was done on its own time, and then you were saying that the golden age of Islam and the initial message of Islam imposed itself and its values on what was there, rather being subsumed into the social values there was. I've been trained in social sciences for a while. I as an anthropologist to be, and probably if we are taught anything, is that to think that everything is socially embedded, our perspectives. And when I come to the text, when I come to read the Quran, I'm reading it through the lens of the perspectives I've learned from my time, um, the frameworks I have in my mind. So, was there really a time, or is it humanly possible to engage with the text without these? Um, I don't know what is it that we're gonna call them, but these structures that structure our the
Biases, yeah, yeah.
structures there is.
Well, no, you cannot really engage with the text without any bias from the society and the framework and the worldview that you come from. But on the other hand, there is a reality for the text. You see, the problem with contemporary social anthropology, let's say, it comes from a relativistic philosophy that doesn't believe, let's say, if you're talking about ethics and morality, it doesn't believe in a core of morality. It believes that morality is a product of a society. And therefore, just every society has a different morality. Some societies are fine with murder, some societies are okay with murder. So this is good here and this is not good here. In Islam, murder is haram. Like, to take one's life is fixed. If a society um, makes murder part of its culture, then that society is wrong. And we have right and wrong in Islam. So what I'm saying is, yes, you would read with your worldview, and there will always be a bias when you read. But as your other question is there then a number of Islams as many as there is a number of Muslims? No, there is Islam as well. There is a core of it. And there is right and wrong. And there is truth and falsehood. And oneness of Allah is truth. And anything other than Allah to be worshipped is false. And charity and family and so forth is truth, and adultery and murder and usury and so on is false. So that is different from the the framework of everything is socially constructed. No, there is at the core of the social construction a philosophy or an ideology. In the case of what you're talking about, this is an ideology that is relativistic, that defines truth in a relativistic way. Um, or it might define truth in a rational way, a la Kant and so on, a la the Renaissance. But this is a different philosophy from the Islamic philosophy. Or it defines truth, or it doesn't even have truth in a deconstructionist way. And all of that. These philosophies are at the core of how you read the text. And if at the core of how you read the text is the text, because you believe in it, you reach a point where you are a mu'mina. You actually believe in that text and its truths. And therefore, what is true in the text, not necessarily what is clear linguistically. What is true is not equal to what is clear linguistically. We mix that because of a problem with some of the usul fiqh understanding. What is true is what is central, not necessarily what is clear, because it could be a clear expression, but it's relative. It talks about a particular time. It talks about the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ that might or might not apply today, you see. But it's a clear expression, but it talks about history. But the core of the script is the central meanings of these 7 elements I mentioned in my research, the central objectives, the central concepts, the central values. Ar-Rahmah, or mercy, will always be a central value in Islam. And we should not allow any relativism in that. There is a relativism in the application, the manifestation, what we call in Arabic التنزيل or تطبيق. But الرحمة remains the rahmah. We should not allow cruelty or القسوة or كنت فظا غليظ القلب or قسوة القلب. That is not Islamic, you see. But then in the manifestation of rahmah, there could be 100 ways of imagining rahmah in a society. That is fine. That is, you see. So the difference between the core issues and the manifestation that is going to be subject to society. Anthropologists end up, like today, they ended up defining even gender socially. The word gender means the type of the human as socially perceived. You know, if you look at how they define. But no, there is nature in here. This is not, we define men and women in Islam based on nature that Allah created based on fitrah. Yes, of course, there is 0.001% people in every society who are confused physically or mentally. That is an irregular case. But Allah created men and women, and we should not say that men and women are socially defined. No, they are naturally defined. They are, but nature is a very loaded word in the English language. I'm aware of that. But if we talk in Arabic, if you talk in Quranic, they are defined by fitrah, not by nature, by fitrah, by God-given structure and God-given psychology and God-given physics. So when they moved from the naturally defined gender into a socially defined gender, they lost their morality in that. They don't have a concept of adultery anymore because of that. And that is not Islamic. And when we move from God-given commands to relative kind of readings, we lose our morality in the sense of reading anything, you know. And people read into the Quran all sorts of sins that cannot be imagined to be Quranic, you see. Allahu A'lam.
Well, thank you very much for your patience.
I
And
hope that this has been useful, not confusing or too general.
no, that was very useful. Thank you very much. I think we have to end the session now. And I'd like to thank
Right
you
on the
very much
chat,
for your time.
my email for anybody who would like to connect on the Maqasid. You have it on the Maqasid Institute website anyway. But this is my email, and jauda@maqasid.org. It's in the connect on the Maqasid Institute, maqasid.org. So I'm willing to answer any question as time permits, inshallah, but anytime. Email me, inshallah, I will email back, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much for your generosity, and we hope to see you again, inshallah.
Allah يكرمك. All the best.
يعطيكم العافية. جزاكم الله خيرا.
الله يحفظكم. جزاكم الله خير وبارك الله فيكم مرة أخرى. ربنا معك. ربنا يكرمك.